A street girl shouted to a building owner, "Don't eat that! Your wife put poison on the way home." The opulence of the city glittered, but it couldn't hide its shadows. Lyra, a forgotten 17-year-old on the streets, never expected to cross paths with Silas Vanderbilt, one of the city's wealthiest men. But when she risked everything to scream a chilling warning at a high-end restaurant, her voice tore through the fabric of wealth and deception. Poison, betrayal, and a desperate fight for truth, all unraveled in one electrifying night. What happens when the invisible exposes the powerful? The storm that follows shakes more than just one life. But before we dive deep into this gripping tale, let me know where you're tuning in from in the comments below. And if this story captures your interest, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next twist-filled journey. The city never truly slept. It thrived on movement, constant, relentless, and indifferent. Neon lights painted the rain-slicked streets in shades of electric pink and green, illuminating the endless rush of cars, buses, and hurried pedestrians. In this sprawling urban jungle, every corner pulsed with life, from the laughter spilling out of packed bars to the muffled arguments inside cramped apartments. Somewhere in the chaos, Lyra existed on the fringes, unnoticed and forgotten. Lyra was 17, but looked younger, her petite frame and hollowed cheeks a testament to years of surviving the streets. Once, she had a home and parents who adored her. But life had a cruel way of unraveling. A car accident took her family when she was just a child, and the foster system became her only option, a system that chewed her up and spit her out when she refused to conform. Now, she scraped by, living off scraps and discarded dreams. At her core, Lyra was a fighter. Her almond-shaped eyes sparkled with defiance, even when her stomach twisted in painful hunger. She'd learned to navigate the city's darker alleys, where kindness was rare, and survival meant keeping one step ahead of desperation. Yet, as she leaned against a graffiti-covered wall that night, clutching her makeshift cardboard shelter, even she couldn't ignore the gnawing doubt creeping in. "All day," she whispered to herself, her voice raw and determined. "This world will see me as more than just a street rat." The storm had rolled in without warning, drenching the city in a relentless downpour. Lyra huddled beneath the narrow awning of a closed storefront, her damp hoodie doing little to shield her from the cold. The air smelled of wet asphalt and distant gasoline, a smell she'd grown used to over the years. Her fingers tightened around the frayed edges of her cardboard piece, a pathetic excuse for protection, but the only thing she had. Across the street, a limousine pulled up to the curb, its sleek black exterior glistening under the rain. The sight was a stark contrast to Lyra's reality. Wealth, on full display, arrogant and unyielding. A woman stepped out, her scarlet heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Her tailored coat and diamond-studded earrings screamed money, but it was her commanding presence that caught Lyra's attention. Grace Vanderbilt. The name alone was enough to spark recognition. She was a regular in the tabloids, a socialite, married to one of the city's most powerful businessmen, Silas Vanderbilt. Grace was beauty and elegance personified, but there was something in the cold precision of her movements that unnerved Lyra. As Grace strode toward the high-end restaurant, Lyra's stomach growled loudly, a painful reminder of her reality. Hunger gnawed at her insides, relentless and unforgiving. Desperation, an old but unwelcome companion, clawed its way to the surface. Without thinking, Lyra stepped out of her shadowed corner and into the light of the street lamp. "Please," Ira called out, her voice trembling, but audible enough to cut through the rain. She stepped closer, her hands outstretched. "Ma'am, just a little food." Grace froze mid-step, turning slowly to face Lyra. Her icy blue eyes swept over the girl, taking in her soaked hoodie, the frayed edges of her jeans, and the vulnerability etched into her young face. For a brief moment, something flickered in her gaze, recognition, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Food?" Grace's voice was sharp, cutting through the hum of rain. "Someone like you? You'd waste it." Street kids only know how to take. Lyra flinched, but stood her ground. I'm not a thief, she said, her voice firmer now. I just need... Enough! Grace's tone was dismissive, her words slicing through Lyra's defiance like a blade. You're a nuisance. People like you are stains on this city. The words hit harder than Lyra expected, each one a reminder of the countless times she'd been ignored, rejected, or treated like she didn't belong. She clenched her fists, her pride warring with the reality of her situation. For a moment, the two women stood in the rain, locked in a silent standoff. Grace's expression was unreadable, her polished exterior as impermeable as the limousine behind her. Lyra, drenched and shivering, refused to look away. Despite the vast gulf between their worlds, Lyra's gaze was steady, her unspoken defiance a challenge Grace couldn't ignore. Get out of my sight, Grace finally said, her voice low but laced with venom. She turned on her heel and disappeared into the restaurant, leaving Lyra standing alone in the rain. As the heavy glass doors closed behind Grace, Lyra's shoulders sagged under the weight of her reality. The city's neon lights flickered above her, reflecting in the puddles at her feet. Despite the humiliation, a spark of determination ignited within her. She'll remember me, Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. One day, they all will. She turned and disappeared into the night, her small frame swallowed by the sprawling city, but her resolve burned brighter than ever. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, the rhythmic patter on the pavement blending with the faint hum of distant traffic. Lyra stood under the dim glow of a street lamp, her breath visible in the chill night air. Across the street, the luxury restaurant loomed like a monument to exclusivity. Warm light spilled from its tall windows, showcasing elegantly dressed patrons inside. The contrast between that world and her own couldn't have been starker. A sleek black limousine pulled up to the curb, its engine purring softly before coming to a halt. The back door opened smoothly, and Grace Vanderbilt emerged, a vision of wealth and control. Her scarlet heels clicked sharply against the wet pavement, the sound cutting through the night like a metronome marking time. Her perfectly tailored coat, cinched at the waist, emphasized her slender figure, while a cascade of diamonds glinted from her ears and wrist. Her presence demanded attention, and even passers-by slowed to steal a glance at the city's most notorious socialite. Relief went quickly, and pain followed within. Lyra's stomach tightened as the aroma of roasted meat and freshly baked bread wafted from the restaurant, a cruel reminder of her empty belly. Her hunger, coupled with the bitter cold, drove her to act against her usual instincts. Normally, she avoided people like Grace, knowing full well how they viewed people like her. But desperation had a way of silencing caution. Now or never, Lyra whispered to herself, stepping out from the shadows. Her approach was cautious at first, her steps hesitant. As Grace turned toward the restaurant's entrance, her back to the street, Lyra quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest. When she was only a few feet away, Lyra stretched out her hand, her voice trembling but audible. "Please, ma'am, just a little food," Carrie said. Grace stopped abruptly, her posture stiffening. Slowly, she turned to face Lyra, her icy blue eyes narrowing as they swept over the bedraggled girl before her. The rain had plastered Lyra's dark hair to her face, and her oversized hoodie hung limply from her small frame, the fabric soaked and clinging to her skin. For a moment, Grace's expression flickered with something unspoken, perhaps annoyance, perhaps disdain. "Food?" Grace repeated, her tone sharp and incredulous. "Someone like you?" Lyra flinched at the question but held her ground. "Yes," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I haven't eaten in—" Grace cut her off with a cold, dismissive wave of her hand. "Enough. People like you are a plague on this city, always taking, never giving. You'd waste whatever was given to you." Lyra's cheeks burned with humiliation, but a spark of defiance flared within her. She straightened her posture, meeting Grace's gaze with a boldness she hadn't realized she possessed. "I'm not a thief," Lyra said firmly, her voice rising above the sound of the drizzle. Grace's lips curled into a faint smirk, but there was no warmth in it. "You're a nuisance," she interrupted, her voice laced with venom. "Street kids like you are stains on this city." The word struck Lyra like a slap, each syllable sharp and cutting. Her fists clenched at her sides, but she refused to look away, even as tears threatened to spill. The weight of Grace's judgment was crushing, but Lyra's pride refused to let her crumble completely. Around them, the city carried on, oblivious to the exchange. A few pedestrians glanced in their direction, but quickly looked away, uninterested in the drama unfolding between two vastly different worlds. As Grace turned away, clearly dismissing Lyra as beneath her notice, Lyra caught something unusual in the woman's eyes, something calculating and cold. It wasn't just disdain, it was something darker, more deliberate. The realization sent a chill down Lyra's spine, though she couldn't yet place why. Grace adjusted the strap of her designer handbag and strode toward the restaurant, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. The doorman greeted her with a polite nod, holding the door open as she swept inside without so much as a backward glance. For Grace, the encounter was over, forgotten as easily as brushing off lint from her coat. But for Lyra, it was anything but. She stood frozen for a moment, her mind replaying the exchange in vivid detail. The sting of Grace's words lingered, but beneath the hurt, something else simmered. Anger, yes, but also determination. She had spent her life being overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated. But this was different. This time, she couldn't shake the feeling that Grace's cruelty wasn't just a symptom of privilege, but a weapon wielded with precision. As the glass doors of the restaurant closed behind Grace, Lyra stepped back into the shadows. Her stomach growled again, but the hunger was now overshadowed by something stronger, the need to prove Grace wrong. One day, she thought, her fingers tightening into fists, this world will see me as more than just a street rat. And Grace Vanderbilt? She'll regret looking down on me. Rain continued to streak down the restaurant's tall windows as Lyra lingered in the shadows, her body pressed against the cold stone of the building. From her vantage point, she could see the opulent dining area illuminated by soft golden lights. Grace Vanderbilt was seated at the center of it all, her elegant figure framed by the glittering crystal chandeliers above. The contrast between Lyra's damp, shivering form outside and the warmth of the scene inside couldn't have been starker. Lyra had planned to walk away, to forget the humiliation and find some corner to curl up in for the night. But something about Grace had unsettled her, the woman's cold detachment sticking like a thorn in Lyra's thoughts. Then she saw Grace rise gracefully from her chair and disappear through a side door, her movements quick and deliberate. Curiosity, sharp and unwelcome, pricked at Lyra's instincts. Her initial hesitation gave way to resolve as she quietly moved toward the side of the restaurant, keeping to the shadows. The service entrance was slightly ajar, and Lyra slipped inside, her heart hammering against her ribs. After 15 minutes, fire reached the front of the restaurant and led her down the hall. The air in the kitchen was humid and heavy with the scent of roasting meats and simmering sauces. Lyra crouched low behind a stack of empty crates, her small frame hidden from view. Grace stood at the far counter, her back turned to the bustling kitchen staff. The waiters and cooks were busy with their tasks, oblivious to the socialite's presence. Lyra's breath caught as she saw Grace reach into her handbag, pulling out a small glass vial filled with a thick, dark liquid. Grace's gloved hands moved with practiced ease as she unscrewed the cap and tilted the vial over a plated dish. The liquid oozed out, blending seamlessly with the rich sauce already coating the food. "What is she doing?" Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible above the clatter of pans. Her hands clutched the edge of the crate as her mind raced to comprehend what she was seeing. Is she really? As Grace set the vial back into her bag, her mask of composure cracked for a fleeting moment. A cold, predatory smile spread across her lips, one that chilled Lyra to the bone. It wasn't just cruelty, it was premeditated malice. "Effective, isn't it?" she asked Grace grimly. For a brief second, Lyra considered turning and running. She didn't belong here. If anyone caught her, she'd be thrown out, or worse. But then her gaze drifted to the dish Grace had tampered with. She'd seen the seating chart earlier through the restaurant's large windows, heard a waiter mention Mr. Vanderbilt's table. That dish was meant for Silas Vanderbilt. Lyra's pulse quickened. What if Grace was trying to kill him? The thought seemed absurd, but the scene unfolding before her made it impossible to dismiss. Panic bubbled in her chest as she weighed her options. She could burst into the dining area, scream the truth, and hope someone believed her. But what proof did she have? Who would trust a homeless girl over a respected Vanderbilt? On the other hand, staying silent could mean letting a man die. Her internal debate was cut short as Grace smoothed her coat, her icy composure fully restored. With one last glance at the dish, she turned and exited the kitchen, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. Lyra remained frozen in place, torn between fear and the overwhelming need to act. Finally, with a shaky breath, she whispered, "I can't let this happen." Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Lyra slipped out of her hiding spot, ready to face whatever came next. The dining room was the picture of opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung above, their light refracting in delicate rainbows across the polished silverware and gleaming glassware. Immaculate white tablecloths stretched over tables where the city's elite dined, their low murmurs of conversation interspersed with occasional laughter. The warm ambiance was punctuated by the soft clinking of forks against plates and the subtle rustle of waitstaff moving seamlessly through the room. At the center of it all sat Silas Vanderbilt, his presence commanding even in quiet repose. Dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit, he was deep in conversation with a business associate, his tone measured and authoritative. Across from him, the empty seat where Grace had been moments earlier now felt like a silent omen. The waiter approached their table with perfect poise, balancing a gleaming silver tray with a single dish at its center. Steam curled upwards from the plate, carrying the tantalizing aroma of the restaurant's finest entree. Silas paused mid-sentence, glancing briefly at the dish before looking back at his companion. Just as the waiter began to set the plate down in front of him, the dining room's delicate symphony shattered. "Stop, don't eat that." The voice, shrill and desperate, cut through the refined atmosphere like a knife. Heads turned toward the source of the commotion as Lyra burst through the double doors, her small frame soaked from the rain and trembling with adrenaline. Her wide eyes darted to Silas, then to the dish now resting on the table before him. "What is the meaning of this?" Silas demanded, startled. His deep voice carried across the room, quieting the murmurs that had begun to ripple among the diners. Lyra took another step forward, her voice cracking as she screamed, "Your wife poisoned it! Don't eat it!" The room fell into a stunned silence. Gasps echoed from nearby tables, and a woman covered her mouth in horror. Silas's hand, which had been reaching for his fork, froze midair. His piercing gaze shifted to Lyra, assessing the disheveled girl standing before him. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone sharp and incredulous. Lyra opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a figure emerged from the shadows with practiced grace. "Oh, this little girl." Grace's voice was calm, but the sweet undertone carried a venomous edge. She moved to Silas's side, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Her expression was one of composed concern, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of icy calculation as she looked at Lyra. She must be confused. "Security." Two burly guards moved toward Lyra, their steps heavy and deliberate. Panic surged through her as she realized her window to act was closing fast. But she kept her hand on the wheel, holding it tight, as a large figure ran from the building. "Don't listen to her," Lyra cried, her voice raw and urgent. She pointed a trembling finger at Grace. "I saw her in the kitchen. She put something in your food. There's poison in it." Grace let out a soft, incredulous laugh. "Poison? How absurd." She turned to the room, addressing the stunned onlookers with a carefully crafted air of pity. "This poor child must be starving, or mentally unwell," she sighed theatrically. "She's probably just looking for attention." Lyra's hands balled into fists, her nails digging into her palms. "She's lying. She has a vial in her bag. Check it." Her gaze darted desperately to Silas. "Please, you have to believe me." Silas hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he glanced between Lyra and Grace. The accusation hung heavy in the air, its weight pressing on everyone in the room. His fork remained untouched, resting near the edge of his plate. Grace's expression hardened imperceptibly, the warmth in her voice cooling as she addressed Silas. "Darling, don't let this nonsense ruin your evening. Security will handle it." She placed a delicate hand on his shoulder, her manicured nails grazing the fabric of his suit. "Eat your dinner. You've had a long day." Silas looked at her hand, then back at Lyra, who was now struggling as the guards grabbed her arms. "No, don't eat it!" she screamed, her voice growing hoarse as she thrashed against their grip. "I'm telling the truth. You'll die if you—" Her words were cut off as the guards began dragging her toward the exit. Her feet skidded against the floor, her resistance only earning her tighter grips on her arms. She kicked and twisted, but it was no use. The onlookers watched in stunned silence, unsure whether to intervene or remain seated in their safe bubble of civility. As the glass doors closed behind her, muffling her desperate cries, Silas's gaze lingered on the dish before him. He felt Grace's hand gently squeeze his shoulder, her voice a soothing melody against his rising doubts. "It's ridiculous," she murmured. "You know how these street kids can be." Silas nodded slowly, but didn't pick up his fork right away. His mind replayed the girl's frantic words, the raw desperation in her voice. Something about it clung to him, like the faint but distinct sense that something was off. After a moment, he sighed, shaking his head as if to dispel the lingering unease. He reached for the fork. The room held its collective breath as he sliced into the tender meat and brought it to his lips. From her place outside, pressed against the cold glass and still struggling against the grip of security, Lyra screamed one last time, her voice breaking. "Don't," saying. But her plea was drowned out by the rain and the heavy silence that followed. Silas chewed thoughtfully, his expression unchanging, then reached for his wine. Grace's lips curved into a subtle smile as her fingers tightened around the strap of her handbag. It was only when Silas's hand began to tremble, knocking over the wine glass, that the room erupted into chaos. The clink of Silas's fork hitting the edge of his plate was the first sound to disturb the tense stillness of the dining room. For a brief moment, nothing seemed amiss. Silas leaned back slightly, chewing thoughtfully, his expression neutral. Grace, seated beside him now, sipped her wine with practiced elegance, her demeanor calm and composed. Then came the subtle change, a twitch of Silas's fingers as he reached for his glass. It was almost imperceptible at first, but as he raised the wine to his lips, his hand began to tremble. The glass tipped forward slightly, spilling crimson liquid onto the pristine white tablecloth. A hush fell over the dining room as Silas's business associate leaned in, concern flickering across his face. "Silas, are you all right?" Silas opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His complexion turned ashen, and beads of sweat appeared on his brow. His fork clattered loudly to the table as his entire body convulsed, his muscles tightening as if an unseen force had taken hold of him. His lips parted in a desperate attempt to gasp for air, but his breaths came shallow and labored. The spilled wine began to spread across the table, the deep red liquid seeping into the fabric like blood pooling from an unseen wound. The contrast between the vivid stain and the stark white cloth was almost too striking, a harrowing foreshadowing of what was to come. "Silas!" the associate exclaimed, rising to his feet. The man's alarmed voice cut through the growing murmur of concern from the surrounding tables. "What's happening?" Grace, seated just inches away from her husband, froze for a split second, her face unreadable. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, she sprang into action, her voice rising in dramatic panic. "Oh my God, someone help him!" she cried, her perfectly manicured hand clutching her chest. "He's choking! Call an ambulance!" The dining room erupted into chaos. Guests abandoned their seats, some rushing toward Silas while others stumbled back in fear. A waiter knocked over a tray of glasses in his hurry to grab a phone, the crash adding to the cacophony. Meanwhile, Grace leaned over Silas, her expression one of practiced terror, as she gently cradled his head. Through it all, Silas's condition worsened. His pale skin had taken on a faint bluish hue, and his gasps grew weaker, his body slumping further in the chair. His hand twitched violently, knocking over another glass, which shattered against the marble floor. The sound sent a jolt through the panicked crowd, heightening the tension in the room. Outside the restaurant, Lyra pressed her hands against the glass doors, her breath fogging the surface. She could see everything: the spilled wine, the frantic movement of the staff and guests, and Silas's slumped form. Her own scream tore from her throat, raw and desperate, but it was swallowed by the muffling rain and the thick glass separating her from the chaos inside. "No!" she shouted, slamming her fists against the door. I told you it was poisoned." Her voice, filled with anguish, went unheard. Tears streamed down her face as she watched helplessly, her reflection barely visible in the rain-streaked glass. The cold night air bit at her skin, but the ache in her chest was far worse. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, the scene inside unfolding as if in slow motion. Back in the dining room, Grace's cries for help grew more frantic, her performance flawless. "Where's the paramedics? He's not breathing!" she shouted, her hands hovering just above Silas's chest as if she were too overwhelmed to act. Her voice carried a convincing note of helplessness, a stark contrast to the calculated coldness that had gripped her in the kitchen earlier. Silas's body gave a final, violent shudder before going still, his head lolling to one side. Gasps and cries filled the room as some of the guests turned away, unable to watch. A server attempted to administer CPR, his hands pressing firmly against Silas's chest, but the grim reality of the situation hung heavy in the air. Through the glass, Lyra's legs gave out, and she sank to the ground, her fists still clenched against the door. The rain soaked her further, but she barely noticed. All she could see was the lifeless figure of the man she had tried so desperately to save, and the woman who had orchestrated it all, standing at the center of the chaos, her mask of concern firmly in place. As the sound of sirens began to grow in the distance, Lyra whispered, her voice trembling with both rage and grief. "I warned them, but no one listened." The fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway flickered intermittently, casting a pale, sterile glow that reflected off the polished tiles. The air smelled of antiseptic and faintly of something metallic. Inside the trauma room, chaos reigned as a team of doctors and nurses worked frantically to stabilize Silas Vanderbilt. The machines around his bed beeped with an urgent rhythm, their sounds overlapping with clipped commands and the rustle of medical equipment. Silas lay motionless on the hospital bed, his pallor ghostly against the stark white sheets. A nurse adjusted the oxygen mask covering his face, her hands steady despite the tension in the room. One of the doctors leaned over him, shouting for epinephrine, as another began chest compressions. Every second felt like an eternity, the grim battle between life and death playing out in sharp focus. Outside the trauma room, the waiting area was eerily quiet, the stark contrast amplifying the tension. Grace Vanderbilt sat in the corner, her back ramrod straight, her perfectly styled hair just slightly disheveled. A calculated touch. A silk scarf hung loosely around her neck, and her red heels, still damp from the rain, were neatly crossed at the ankles. She dabbed at her eyes with the tissue, the picture of a distraught wife holding herself together through sheer willpower. When a uniformed detective approached, Grace looked up, her expression shifting seamlessly from grief to quiet determination. "Detective," she said softly, her voice trembling just enough to sound genuine. "Thank you for coming so quickly. This has been a nightmare." The detective, a grizzled man with tired eyes, nodded and pulled out a small notebook. "Mrs. Vanderbilt, I need to ask you a few questions about what happened tonight." Grace exhaled shakily, clutching the tissue tighter. "Of course, anything to help." She glanced toward the trauma room, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "My husband, I don't know how this could happen." The detective's pen hovered over the page. "Do you have any idea who might want to harm Mr. Vanderbilt?" Grace hesitated, then lowered her voice, as if reluctant to say the words. "There was a girl," she said, her tone cautious. "I don't know her name, but she's been stalking us for days." The detective's eyebrows furrowed. "A girl? Can you describe her?" "She's young," Grace continued, her voice breaking slightly. "Homeless, I think. She's been hanging around outside the restaurant, watching us. Tonight she barged in, screaming accusations." Grace's hands trembled as she pressed the tissue to her lips. I think she put something in Silas's drink while we weren't looking." The detective scribbled notes, his expression darkening. "You're saying she poisoned him?" Grace nodded slowly. "I can't prove it, but I don't know how else to explain this. She was so desperate, so angry. Maybe she thought she could steal from us and panicked when Silas caught her." Her voice wavered as she added, "I just want to help find the truth." As the detective finished his notes, a commotion at the far end of the hallway drew his attention. 2 officers were escorting Lyra toward them, her wrists bound in handcuffs. Her hoodie was soaked, her hair plastered to her face, and her wide, frantic eyes darted between the officers and Grace. "Let me go," Lyra shouted, struggling against their grip. "You've got it all wrong. I didn't do anything." The detective stepped forward, raising a hand to calm the scene. "All right, enough, let's talk." He turned his gaze to Lyra, his tone firm but not unkind. "You've been caught trespassing before. What's your game, girl?" Lyra shook her head vehemently, her voice desperate. "It wasn't me. I didn't do anything to him. She did it." She pointed a trembling finger at Grace, her voice cracking. "I saw her in the kitchen. She put something in his food." The detective frowned, glancing back at Grace, who clutched her scarf as if Lyra's words were a physical blow. "Me?" Grace said, her voice trembling with disbelief. "You're accusing me? That's absurd." "She's lying," Lyra cried, her voice rising with urgency. "She has a vial in her bag. Check it. That's what she used." The detective's gaze hardened as he turned back to Lyra. "You're saying Mrs. Vanderbilt poisoned her own husband? That's a serious accusation, kid." "I'm telling the truth," Lyra insisted, tears streaming down her face. "She's the one you should be arresting, not me." Grace sighed, her expression tinged with pity. "Detective," she said softly, "I think she's confused, or worse, unwell. I can't imagine what kind of life she's had to lead, but she clearly needs help." The detective's jaw tightened as he considered both women. Lyra's pleas rang with raw sincerity, but her disheveled appearance and history of trespassing worked against her. Grace, on the other hand, radiated composed grief, her words measured and her demeanor calm. "Take her to holding," the detective said finally, motioning to the officers. Lyra's protests grew louder as she was dragged away, her cries echoing down the hallway. "You're making a mistake," she shouted. "She's going to get away with it. You have to believe me." Grace watched the scene unfold with an expression of carefully concealed satisfaction. Once Lyra was out of sight, she turned back to the detective, her tears renewed. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I just want to focus on my husband now." The detective nodded, tucking his notebook away. "We'll investigate every lead, Mrs. Vanderbilt, I promise." Grace smiled faintly, the edges of her lips curling ever so slightly. "I appreciate that," she said, her voice honeyed. I truly do. The metal door clanged shut behind her, echoing through the cold, damp corridor. Lyra flinched at the sound, her arms still aching from the officer's rough grip. The small jail cell felt like an insult piled atop her humiliation. The walls, gray and unyielding, seemed to close in around her, suffocating her spirit. The flickering fluorescent bulb above cast harsh shadows that danced across the floor, exaggerating the loneliness of the tiny space. Lyra sank onto the cold, hard bench, her knees pulled up to her chest. Her damp hoodie clung to her like a second skin, its fabric heavy with rain and despair. She pressed her forehead against her knees, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she tried to steady herself. For the first time that night, the adrenaline that had fueled her began to wane, leaving behind an ache that went deeper than her bruised wrists or soaked clothes. In the stillness, her thoughts began to spiral. The image of Silas collapsing haunted her, his ashen face, his trembling hands, the way his body had gone slack as chaos erupted around him. And then there was Grace, so composed in her feigned panic, her lies slipping from her lips as smoothly as silk. The memory of her cold smile in the kitchen sent a shiver down Lyra's spine. "I don't believe me," Lyra whispered to herself, her voice cracking. The guards, the detective, even the other diners, none of them had seen what she'd seen, and now Silas lay in a hospital bed, teetering between life and death, while Grace walked free. The injustice of it all pressed down on her chest like a physical weight. Her eyes stung with tears, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she forced herself to sit up straighter, leaning her back against the wall. In the dim light, her gaze softened as her mind drifted to a distant memory, one she rarely allowed herself to revisit. She pictured her parents' faces, though the details had grown blurry over the years. Her father's warm laugh, her mother's gentle hands braiding her hair. It all felt like a lifetime ago. She remembered the promises she'd made to herself after losing them, to stay strong, to never let the world break her, no matter how cruel it became. She'd repeated those promises like a mantra during her hardest nights on the streets, clutching them tightly like a lifeline. And yet here she was, locked in a cell, accused of a crime she didn't commit. The world had always been stacked against her, but this felt different. This wasn't just about her survival anymore. It was about doing what was right. Her jaw tightened as a surge of determination coursed through her veins. She couldn't afford to wallow in self-pity. Silas didn't have time for her to doubt herself, and letting Grace win wasn't an option. If no one else would fight for the truth, she would. The world always crushes the weak, she thought, her internal voice steadier now, fueled by anger and resolve. But if I stop fighting now, Silas will die, and she'll get away with it. Not this time. Her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms as she leaned forward. She stared at the floor, her mind racing through every detail of the night. There had to be something she'd missed, some way to prove her innocence and expose Grace for what she truly was. The memory of the vial flashed in her mind, the way Grace had slipped it back into her bag, the smugness in her eyes as she feigned ignorance. "I'll make them see," Lyra whispered fiercely. Her voice echoed softly against the walls, but it felt louder, stronger than before. She lifted her head, her chin tilting upward in defiance of her circumstances. The cell was cold and unwelcoming, but it couldn't hold her spirit. They might have taken her freedom for now, but they hadn't taken her resolve. If anything, this only solidified her purpose. One way or another, she would find a way out. And when she did, she'd make sure Grace Vanderbilt's lies unraveled for the world to see. "You understand nothing of the reason I discovered this." The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the first sound to pierce the heavy fog clouding Silas Vanderbilt's mind. Each beep was steady, grounding him in the sterile reality of his surroundings. The fluorescent lights overhead burned bright against his heavy eyelids as he stirred, his body aching with a weariness he couldn't yet place. His throat felt dry, and his limbs seemed leaden, refusing to respond with their usual strength. "Mr. Vanderbilt?" A voice called softly. It was calm, professional, belonging to a doctor who stood at his bedside. Silas turned his head slightly, the motion slow and deliberate, his vision sharpening bit by bit. He saw the concerned face of the physician and the faint hum of medical machines around him. "Dr. Vanderbilt? Mr. Vanderbilt? Where?" His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "You're in the hospital," the doctor explained gently, checking the IV in Silas's arm. "You experienced a severe toxic reaction, but you're stable now. We were able to counteract most of the poison." The word hit him like a thunderclap. Poison. The events of the evening rushed back to him in broken fragments. The dinner, the dish placed before him, the warmth of the dining room, and then the chaos. His hand trembled slightly as he tried to sit up, his strength faltering. "Easy, Mr. Vanderbilt," the doctor said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've been through a lot. You need rest." Patrick rested his hand on his shoulder, but Silas's mind was already racing, piecing together the disjointed images. A girl had burst into the dining room, her voice sharp and urgent, cutting through the elegance of the evening like shattered glass. He remembered her wild eyes, her drenched clothes, her desperate warning. "Don't eat that! Your wife poisoned it!" "There was a girl," Silas rasped, his words weak but insistent. "She knew. She tried to save me." The doctor's brow furrowed, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he adjusted the monitors and made notes on his clipboard. "You've been under a lot of stress, Mr. Vanderbilt," he said after a moment. "It's not uncommon to have disoriented memories after an ordeal like this." But Silas shook his head slowly, his lips tightening in frustration. No, she said something. She knew." His voice grew quieter, his tone turning inward. "How would she know?" The doctor hesitated, then stepped back. "You've had a very close call," he said firmly. "Your body is recovering, but you need to let your mind do the same. Rest for now, and we'll check in on you soon." He gave Silas a reassuring nod before stepping out of the room, leaving Silas alone with his thoughts. As silence enveloped the room, Silas let his head fall back against the pillow. His gaze fixed on the ceiling, but his mind drifted to Grace. She had been there, hadn't she? Hovering at his side, calling for help, holding his hand as if she were the picture of a devoted wife. But something about the memory felt off. He couldn't shake the lingering unease that had been growing since the girl's outburst. Silas closed his eyes, trying to remember the moments before the meal. Grace had left the table for a few minutes. She'd said something about needing to make a call. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it. Grace was always busy, always networking or smoothing over some social obligation. But now, the timing gnawed at him. Why had she left just before the food was served? "She wouldn't," he muttered under his breath, his voice tinged with doubt. But why would Grace? His thoughts turned back to the girl. She had seemed so sure, so certain of her accusation. And the way she'd been dragged out of the room, her screams ringing out even as the glass doors muffled them, stayed with him. What had she been trying to tell him? And why had no one listened? Silas's breathing grew heavier as the fragmented memories began to coalesce into something more coherent. His hand instinctively reached for the call button at his bedside. He needed answers. He needed to know who that girl was, what she had seen, and why she had risked so much to warn him. But more than anything, he needed to understand what Grace might be hiding. As the nurse entered the room, responding to his call, Silas's resolve hardened. His voice, though still faint, carried a note of determination. "I need to speak to someone about the girl," he said. "Find her." Exiting the hospital with him, she followed the nurse back to her office and grabbed her pens and paper. "Time to write this down." The nurse hesitated, glancing at his pale face. "Mr. Vanderbilt, are you sure?" "I'm sure," Silas interrupted, his tone more forceful now. "Find her, before it's too late." The nurse nodded and hurried out, leaving Silas alone once more. His heart pounded weakly in his chest, but his mind was sharper than it had been in hours. Somewhere the truth was waiting to be uncovered, and, for the first time, Silas was ready to look for it. The air in the holding cell was cold and heavy, the faint hum of fluorescent lights the only sound accompanying Lyra's restless pacing. Her mind raced, replaying every moment of the evening like a frayed reel of film. She couldn't afford to stay here, waiting for a justice system that would never believe her. Silas's life was hanging by a thread, and Grace was still free to finish what she had started. Lyra clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. She had to get out. The sound of footsteps approaching the cell door snapped her out of her thoughts. A guard appeared, unlocking the door to bring her a tray of food. His movements were slow, almost careless, as if he didn't see her as a threat. Lyra's sharp eyes took in every detail, the keys dangling from his belt, the way his focus wavered as he glanced down the hallway. This was her chance. The guard set the tray on the bench and turned toward the door. In one swift motion, Lyra lunged, grabbing the edge of the tray and sending it crashing to the floor. The metallic clang of the tray hitting the tiles made the guard spin around in surprise, and she used the momentary distraction to dart past him. "Hey!" he shouted, fumbling for his radio, but Lyra was already through the door. Her bare feet slapped against the cold floor as she sprinted down the dimly lit corridor. The alarm blared behind her, its shrill wail echoing off the walls and spurring her forward. She reached the end of the hall where another guard stepped into her path, his hand outstretched to stop her. Thinking fast, Lyra ducked low, sliding across the wet floor beneath his grasp before bolting toward the nearest exit. The heavy rain hit her like a wall as she burst through the door into the night. The city's labyrinthine streets stretched out before her, the neon glow of distant signs reflecting off the slick pavement. She didn't stop to catch her breath, her small frame weaving through the shadows with practiced ease. Behind her, the sound of pursuit grew louder. Flashlights cut through the darkness as officers called out, their voices urgent and angry. Leah's heart pounded in her chest, but she pushed herself harder, the rain soaking her to the bone as she turned sharply into an alley. The alley was narrow, lined with overflowing dumpsters and broken fire escapes. Spotting an old metal ladder hanging just within reach, Lyra leapt, her fingers gripping the rusted rungs. She climbed quickly, ignoring the sharp pain in her palms as the metal bit into her skin. Below, the officers struggled to navigate the slippery alley, their shouts muffled by the storm. Reaching the rooftop, Lyra paused for a split second to scan her surroundings. The city stretched out beneath her, a maze of glowing windows and rain-drenched streets. She spotted the distant silhouette of the hospital, its lights a beacon through the gloom. "If I can just get to the hospital before Grace," she murmured to herself, her breath hitching as she began moving again. She ran across the rooftop, leaping over the narrow gaps between buildings with adrenaline-fueled precision. The rain made everything slick, and once she nearly lost her footing, her arms pinwheeling as she barely managed to steady herself. She couldn't afford to fall, not now. Dropping back down to street level, Lyra darted into another alley, her body shivering from the cold. Her bare feet splashed through deep puddles, but she didn't slow down. She could hear sirens in the distance, their mournful wails cutting through the storm. They would be looking for her, scouring the city, but she knew these streets better than they did. At every turn, Lyra relied on her instincts, slipping into shadowed corners and using the chaos of the storm to her advantage. Her small size made it easy to hide, slipping under fences and through narrow gaps that her pursuers couldn't follow. She kept moving, her breath ragged and her muscles burning, but the thought of Silas, still unconscious, still in danger, propelled her forward. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the hospital came into view. Its fluorescent lights flickered faintly through the rain, a stark contrast to the darkness surrounding it. Lyra slowed her pace, ducking into a doorway to catch her breath and survey the entrance. Two police officers stood by the main doors, their presence a reminder that this wouldn't be easy. But Lyra had made it this far, and she wasn't about to give up now. Wiping the rain from her face, she squared her shoulders, her resolve unshaken. "Almost there," she whispered, stepping back into the storm. "I just have to find a way inside." The sterile silence of the hospital was broken only by the faint, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor in Silas Vanderbilt's room. Pale, fluorescent light bathed the space, casting harsh shadows across the walls and illuminating the tubes and wires tethered to his still, fragile form. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, each movement a quiet defiance against the poison that had nearly claimed his life. The door to the room creaked open, the sound subtle but distinct in the quiet. Grace Vanderbilt stepped inside, her red heels muffled against the hospital floor. She had exchanged her usual designer coat for a more inconspicuous trench, and her polished demeanor had given way to a sharp intensity. Clutched in her gloved hand was a syringe, its contents a clear liquid that glinted faintly under the flickering light. Her gaze swept the room, ensuring no nurses or security lingered nearby. Satisfied, she stepped forward, her shadow stretching across the wall like a predator closing in on its prey. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm, its beats eerily in sync with her measured footsteps. She paused by Silas's bedside, her cold blue eyes studying his pale, unconscious face. "You should have stayed unconscious, darling," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. A twisted smile curled her lips as she reached out to brush a strand of hair from his forehead. "Life's simpler that way, for both of us." Grace held up the syringe, angling it carefully as she tapped the side, expelling a single drop of liquid. The sound of the tiny drip hitting the floor was almost imperceptible, but in the charged atmosphere, it seemed deafening. She leaned closer, her breath shallow as she positioned the needle over the IV line running into Silas's arm. The door burst open, slamming against the wall with a force that made Grace flinch. Her head snapped toward the sound, her expression transforming from cool calculation to startled fury. There, standing in the doorway, was Lyra. Her clothes were soaked, her hair clinging to her face, and her eyes burned with defiance, despite the exhaustion etched into every line of her body. "Step away from him," Lyra shouted, her voice cracking but strong. She took a step forward, her fists clenched at her sides. "I know what you're doing, Grace. It's over." Grace's lips pressed into a thin line, her mask of composure slipping as her grip on the syringe tightened. "How did you get in here?" she hissed, her voice sharp and venomous. "I'm not the one who needs to explain myself," Lyra shot back, her gaze darting to the syringe in Grace's hand. "Put it down, now." Grace's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, neither woman moved. The tension in the room was electric, the heart monitor's steady beeping the only sound breaking the silence. Then, Grace's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "You're more resourceful than I gave you credit for," she said, her voice soft but menacing. "Too bad it ends here." With a sudden, fluid motion, Grace lunged towards Silas, aiming the syringe at his IV line. Lyra reacted instantly, throwing herself forward with a speed born of desperation. She collided with Grace, sending them both crashing against the side of the bed. The syringe clattered to the floor, spinning away under the hospital equipment. "Get off me, you little rat," Grace snarled, her nails clawing at Lyra's arms as she struggled to push her off. Lyra held firm, using every ounce of strength she had to keep Grace pinned against the bed frame. "You're not getting away with this," she shouted, her voice raw with determination. Grace twisted violently, managing to break free for a moment. Her hand darted toward the fallen syringe, but Lyra was faster. She dove forward, slamming her hand down on the syringe and kicking it away with her foot. It slid across the floor, disappearing under a cabinet. The noise of their struggle drew attention from the hallway. Nurses and security guards appeared at the doorway, their faces a mix of confusion and alarm. "What's going on here?" one of the nurses demanded, rushing inside. "She was trying to kill him," Lyra gasped, pointing at Grace, who was now disheveled and furious, her veneer of control completely shattered. She had a syringe. "It's under the cabinet." Grace's lips curled into a sneer as she turned to the approaching guards. "This girl is insane," she said, her voice rising in feigned indignation. "She's been stalking us, trying to hurt my husband." "Check the syringe," Leah interrupted, her voice hoarse but insistent. "It's poison. She's lying, just like she's been lying this whole time." The guards exchanged uneasy glances before one of them bent down to retrieve the syringe. As they examined it, a nurse hurried to Silas's side, checking his vitals and ensuring he was still stable. "You're going to regret this," Grace spat, her icy composure cracking as the guards closed in around her. "No," Lyra said, her voice steady despite her trembling limbs. "You are." The atmosphere in the hospital room was thick with tension, the sterile beeping of the heart monitor the only sound cutting through the charged silence. Silas Vanderbilt, still pale and weak, lay propped against his pillows, his breath shallow but deliberate. His eyes, though heavy with exhaustion, flickered between Lyra and Grace as the confrontation erupted in full force. Lyra stood at the foot of his bed, her chest heaving from the effort of her earlier struggle. Her clothes clung to her damp frame, and her fists were clenched at her sides. Despite the exhaustion etched into her features, her voice carried a sharp, unrelenting edge. "Tell him," she screamed, pointing an accusatory finger at Grace. "Tell him what you did." Grace, standing near the cabinet where the syringe had been retrieved, straightened her coat with deliberate calm. Her expression was a mask of cold disdain, though a glint of desperation lurked beneath her icy demeanor. She met Lyra's fiery gaze with a smirk, her voice dripping with condescension. "Do you really think anyone will believe you over me, street trash?" she asked, her tone low and venomous. Silas stirred, his brows knitting together as the weight of Lyra's words pressed down on him. His voice was weak but carried a note of authority. "Enough, Grace," he said, his words deliberate and strained. He fixed his gaze on his wife, his tone heavy with suspicion. "She's telling the truth, isn't she?" For a brief moment, Grace faltered, her polished exterior cracking under the weight of Silas's words. Her carefully maintained facade of innocence wavered, and a flicker of anger passed through her eyes. But just as quickly, she composed herself, letting out a hollow laugh. "Darling," she began, her voice syrupy sweet, "this girl is clearly deranged. She barged in here, accusing me of—" "Stop lying," Lyra shouted, cutting her off. Her voice cracked, but the determination in her words was unyielding. She stepped closer to Silas, her eyes pleading. "I saw her, Mr. Vanderbilt. She was in the kitchen at the restaurant. She poisoned your food, and now she's here to finish the job. She'll say anything to make me look guilty. But you know I'm telling the truth." Grace's smirk dissolved into a sneer. Her fingers curled into fists, and for the first time, her carefully rehearsed composure began to unravel. "You don't know what you're talking about," she hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You have no proof. No one will take your word over mine. You're nothing." Silas's hand moved weakly, his trembling fingers inching toward the emergency call button on the side of the bed. His chest rose and fell with labored breaths, but his eyes remained fixed on Grace. "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but weighted with betrayal. "Why, Grace?" Grace's mask shattered completely, her face twisted in rage, and she took a step toward Lyra, her movements sharp and deliberate. "You think you're so clever," she spat, her voice rising. "You think you can ruin everything I've worked for? I won't let you." Before Lyra could react, Grace lunged, her hand outstretched, aiming to silence her accuser. Lyra stumbled back, her arms flailing in an attempt to shield herself, but the force of Grace's attack knocked her into the edge of the bed. The sudden movement caused Silas's IV stand to wobble, the soft clang of metal against metal adding to the chaos. Summoning what little strength he had left, Silas's trembling hand slammed down on the emergency call button. The shrill alarm blared instantly, cutting through the tension and sending a wave of urgency through the room. Grace turned toward him, her eyes wide with panic. "Silas, don't!" she cried, her voice rising in desperation. But the sound of pounding footsteps echoed in the hallway before she could say another word. The door burst open and a swarm of hospital staff and police officers flooded the room. Their presence immediately shifted the balance of power, and Grace froze, her hands half raised as if caught mid-act. One of the officers spotted the syringe lying on the cabinet and quickly moved to secure it. "This woman tried to kill him," Lyra gasped, her voice hoarse but filled with relief. "She had the syringe. It's poison." Grace whirled to face the officers, her voice shrill and panicked. "She's lying. She's been stalking us for days. She broke in. She's the one who—" "Enough, Mrs. Vanderbilt," one of the officers said firmly, cutting her off. He held up the syringe in a gloved hand. "We'll let the evidence speak for itself." Silas, his voice weak but steady, finally broke the tension. "Take her away," he said, his words heavy with finality. His eyes, filled with equal parts sorrow and disgust, lingered on Grace as the officers moved in to handcuff her. As Grace was led out of the room, she turned back, her gaze narrowing on Lyra. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. But Lyra stood her ground, her expression resolute. Silas turned his gaze to Lyra, a flicker of gratitude in his tired eyes. "You saved my life," he murmured, his voice barely audible but sincere. Lyra nodded, her shoulders relaxing for the first time that night. Someone had to. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the storm's rage replaced by a calm that felt almost surreal. In the sterile confines of the hospital, a new chapter quietly began to unfold. Grace Vanderbilt, handcuffed and flanked by officers, was escorted out of the hospital, her once perfect composure shattered. Whispers rippled through the gathering crowd, a mix of journalists and bystanders who had caught wind of the scandal overnight. Cameras flashed, capturing the fall of a woman who had built her life on lies and manipulation. Inside, Silas Vanderbilt sat upright in his hospital bed, his face pale but resolute. The evening's events had left him shaken to his core, but clarity had begun to take hold. He had spent years turning a blind eye to Grace's coldness, dismissing it as ambition or practicality. But now, faced with the undeniable evidence of her actions, he could no longer excuse the darkness that had consumed their lives together. The door to his room opened quietly and Lyra stepped inside. Her clothes were dry now, though still worn, and her expression was guarded. Despite her small frame and exhaustion, she carried herself with a quiet strength that Silas couldn't help but admire. "Lyra," he said, his voice hoarse but steady, "please, come in." She hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay," she said simply, her tone cautious. "And to see if they believed you." Silas's lips curved into a faint smile. "They did. Thanks to you." He gestured for her to sit, and after a brief pause, she perched on the edge of the chair by his bedside. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of everything that had transpired hanging between them. Finally, Silas spoke, his tone somber. "Grace didn't just try to kill me," he said. "The police found records, financial manipulations, embezzlement, and a web of lies that stretches farther than I ever imagined. She's been under investigation for years, and last night gave them what they needed to act." He shook his head, his expression a mix of sorrow and anger. "I was blind to it all." Lyra shifted in her seat, unsure how to respond. "You couldn't have known," she said softly. "She's good at hiding who she really is." Silas nodded, his gaze meeting hers. "Maybe, but I see things more clearly now." His voice grew steadier as he continued. "When I woke up last night, I remembered what you said, how you risked everything to save me. You had no reason to help, no guarantee anyone would believe you, and yet you still did." He paused, his expression thoughtful. You're stronger than most people I know, Lyra." The words caught her off guard, and she looked away, unsure how to respond. "I just did what was right," she said quietly. "And that's why I owe you more than just my life," Silas replied. "I testified on your behalf this morning. The charges against you have been dropped, and I made sure the authorities know you weren't the one at fault." He hesitated, then added, "But I don't want to stop there." Edrin replied. "If you don't mind, I'd like to stay here and reflect on my choices." Lyra frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Silas leaned forward slightly, his voice filled with conviction. "You shouldn't have to fight to survive. Not anymore. I've seen firsthand how easy it is to overlook people like you. I don't want to be that person anymore. Once I'm discharged, I'm dedicating my resources to helping kids like you, those who've been forgotten by the system." Her eyes widened, and for a moment she couldn't speak. "You don't have to do that for me," she said finally. "I'm not doing it just for you," he said with a faint smile. "I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do." The sincerity in his voice silenced any protest she might have had. For the first time in years, Lyra felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that her fight had been worth it. She wasn't alone anymore. In the weeks that followed, Silas kept his promise. With his influence and wealth, he established shelters and educational programs for street children, creating opportunities for those who had been left behind. Lyra, too, found a place within this new world. She accepted his offer of a home and an education, but she never forgot where she had come from. Her street-smart resilience and compassion remained intact, driving her to mentor other kids who were just like she had been. As she stood at the opening ceremony of one of the new shelters, Lyra spoke to the crowd, her voice steady and confident. "I spent years being invisible, being nothing more than a shadow on the streets. But someone gave me a chance when no one else would. Now, I want to be that someone for others." The applause that followed was deafening, but Lyra didn't need the validation. For the first time, she knew exactly who she was, and she was ready to make sure no one else would ever feel as invisible as she once had. The morning sun bathed the city in a warm glow, its golden rays streaming through the tall windows of the newly built shelter. The room was alive with the chatter of children and the hum of hopeful anticipation. Bright posters adorned the walls, each displaying messages of encouragement and possibility. "You matter," and "A second chance starts here." At the front of the room, Lyra stood behind a podium, her shoulders squared, her expression calm but determined. She had come a long way from the frightened girl clinging to survival on the rain-soaked streets. Now, she exuded confidence and purpose, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Silas Vanderbilt sat in the front row, his recovery evident in the strength that had returned to his posture. He watched her with quiet pride, a small smile playing on his lips. This moment wasn't just about the shelter's opening, it was about something much greater. The ripple effect of compassion and redemption. Lyra took a deep breath, her hands resting lightly on the edges of the podium. She scanned the room, her gaze settling on the children sitting cross-legged on the floor. They reminded her so much of herself, eyes filled with equal parts curiosity and uncertainty, hearts hesitant to trust but yearning for something better. So many people had lost distance from their faith, hoarding the ashes of religion. Lyra was hoping the village ultra, the leadership of the movement. "The world didn't see me as anything but a beggar," she began, her voice steady, resonating with a quiet strength. "For years, I felt invisible. I was cold, hungry, and alone, and every door seemed to close before I could even reach it. I thought that was all I'd ever be. A shadow, something people avoided looking at too closely." Her words hung in the air for a moment, drawing the room into her story. She paused, letting the weight of those memories settle before continuing. "But someone gave me a chance," she said, her gaze shifting briefly to Silas, whose smile deepened in response. "Someone saw past the dirt and desperation and believed that I could be more. That belief saved me. not just from the streets, but from giving up on myself. It's exactly what someone like me needs to hear." The room was silent, every eye fixed on her. She leaned forward slightly, her tone growing more urgent, more hopeful. "Now, I want to be that someone for others. I want to make sure no child feels like they don't matter, like their only future is survival. Because I know what it's like to feel like the world has turned its back on you." Her voice softened, carrying a note of vulnerability. "And I know how powerful it is when someone decides to turn toward you instead." Applause erupted, warm and genuine, filling the room with an energy that felt almost tangible. Lyra stepped back, her chest rising and falling with the emotion of the moment. For a brief second, she allowed herself to take it in. The sound, the smiles, the knowledge that her pain had been transformed into something meaningful. As the applause faded, she looked out at the crowd once more, her eyes lingering on the children. "This shelter isn't just a place to sleep," she said. "It's a place to dream, to heal, to start over. It's proof that your past doesn't define you. Your choices, your heart, your hope, that's what defines you." The children's faces lit up, some nodding, others whispering excitedly to each other. Lyra smiled, her own heart lifting. She had planted a seed in their minds, and she knew it would grow. As the ceremony ended and people began to mill about, Silas approached her, his steps slow but deliberate. "That was incredible," he said, his voice warm with approval. "You've found your voice, Lyra, and you're using it to change lives." She looked at him, a hint of gratitude in her eyes. I learned from the best," she replied, her tone light but sincere. Then, after a pause, she added, "Thank you for everything." Silas shook his head. "No, Lyra, thank you. You reminded me that redemption isn't about what we've lost. It's about what we can build." Aeschylus looked up at his friend, his eyes wide. As they stood together, watching the children explore their new space, Lyra couldn't help but wonder how many of them would one day stand where she was now. The thought filled her with both hope and responsibility. The sun continued to rise, its light streaming in through the windows, casting a golden glow over the shelter. For Lyra, it wasn't just the start of a new chapter. It was the culmination of a hard-fought battle and the beginning of countless new stories for those who would pass through these doors. And as she looked out at the bright faces of the children, one thought lingered in her mind. What if the world turned toward everyone it once ignored? The woman speaking on the screen was Para Nicholson,